I'm going to be talking about the subject that really, obviously, couldn't be more relevant today than one would have imagined. The question of war and peace, and what classical liberalism felt about that. There's a man I'm going to be talking about a good deal. I've already mentioned him in one of my other talks, Richard Cobden, one of the great pro-peace, anti-war liberals of the 19th century, maybe the greatest in a sense. And he's also a member of Parliament, a politician, businessman. And Cobden said the most important domestic issue is foreign policy. And we can see that, I think, today. Foreign policy, not always, but certainly in our own times, in the times of crisis, gravely affects all aspects of political life. Now, you may have heard the term, the phrase, war is the health of the state. I think Murray Rothbard introduced that into the libertarian movement. It was a statement by a early 20th century radical named Randolph Bourne. Now, Bourne was certainly not a libertarian, but he was a kind of progressive. But he broke with his fellow progressives when they started enlisting for the campaign to get America into the First World War. And he became bitterly anti-war and bitterly anti-progressive intellectual. And this phrase encapsulates his view. War is the health of the state. That is, during wartime, state power expands, and occasionally it retracts, but not back to what it had been before. This is the gist of and the kernel of a lot of work by Robert Higgs. And I'm sure that we have some of Bob Higgs's books here. If you haven't read them, well, Crisis and Leviathan, his first big book, is the most important, I think. And what has happened historically, empirically, is that from the time of the Civil War on, whenever America was involved in war, the power of the state expanded in every way, by every measure, the number of state functionaries, the budget of the state, the public debt, and so on. Now, once the crisis was over, then this receded to an extent, but it never went back to what it had been before. And this is the case with every American war. And it's the case really with virtually every government power. I don't know how they ever expect this vast, potentially despotic machine that they've set up now with the Patriot Act and electronic surveillance and total executive power ever to recede. There have been, of course, reform movements in the history of liberalism. The earlier 19th century, when they dismantled, for instance, in England, virtually all of mercantilist legislation that had been on the books for generations. So that was a period of liberal advance. Nowadays, in the midst of universal democracy, with the masses and the rent-seeking constituencies that compose them, well, we'll see what happens. I'm not particularly optimistic about that. Now, the view of the liberals on war did change over time. In the 18th century, famous classical liberals like Immanuel Kant and Tom Paine, of course, very much against war. And what they asserted was that war was the product of kings and aristocrats. the ruling classes of the time, what the liberals often call the parasitic classes, and their vision was that once the people had come to power, then war would gradually and then finally totally disappear. It didn't happen that way, of course. And the French Revolution was a turning point, and should be a lesson to a lot of people who are at least are friendly to libertarianism as to what can happen in what were allegedly well-intentioned wars. French Revolution, a lot of things happened, of course, but then about 1792, 1793, a party comes to power called the Jacobins. Now, by this time, the French revolutionaries, who had been threatened by reactionary powers in Europe, had built up what was the greatest military machine in Europe and probably the world up until that time. Because, to begin with, they introduced conscription. In the old regime, they didn't dare to try to draft everybody. There would have been insurrections, riots, and so on. But now, since the government represented the people, right? It was the voice of the people. No one could have any reasonable objection to being drafted into the army. So the French Revolution had at its disposal vast armies that had never been seen before in Europe. They did away with an officer corps based on rank, privilege, bribery. This is how the armies of and the navies of the old regime were selected their officers. Now, well, since, for instance, the aristocrats had left France, had flown to England and Germany and so on, there was a need for a new officer class. And the people who were promoted to officer position were promoted from the ranks on the basis of merit. If you were a captain or something and were particularly brave and resourceful in a battle, then you could become easily a major, a colonel, and so on. So that they had an excellent officer corps. And then, icing on the cake to top it off, the French Revolution threw up a military genius to rank with Alexander and Hannibal, right? What was his name? What?
Me or her?
Yeah, no, please, that's your little sister. Don't pick on her. You. Napoleon, yes. Okay. So France was totally victorious for a number of years, and the French Revolution and Napoleon, they conquered Italy. They conquered or took control of Germany. They invaded Spain. Napoleon set his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, and then he violated the one with Viscount Montgomery. You know, if you remember him or know of him, a British general in the Second World War, said that the first principle of military science is never invade Russia. And Napoleon violated that and began his downfall. But an interesting thing happened in the course of these great French conquests. In Spain, to an extent, there was a great resistance to the French. In Russia, of course, a great and faithful resistance. But the really interesting case is Germany. Germany had been part of the European Enlightenment. It had produced great Enlightenment thinkers, and the ideas of the Enlightenment and of liberalism were spreading gradually in Germany. And now the French come along and try to impose their ideas of liberty and democracy on the Germans by force, and make the German rulers into their puppets, pass legislation, besides annexing the Rhineland to France and so on, changed their ways, their laws and so on. And it's an odd thing. People do not like foreigners to come in and change their country and change their way of life. So there was a tremendous nationalist reaction in Germany, really the start of German nationalism. It's the first example of blowback. You know, maybe you've heard of that. The only people who seem never to have heard of blowback are Rudy Giuliani and Randy Barnett. Blowback means that you do something and then it has consequences that are very negative from your point of view. Well, it was negative from the French point of view, and it was negative, I'll tell you, from the point of view of liberalism and European culture and civilization. Because the Germans now, Wilhelm von Humboldt is a great example. Now, Humboldt came from this, his brother was a famous scientist, Alexander von Humboldt. There's a county in Northern California named, and the Humboldt Current in the Pacific is named after him. He was a great geographer and explorer and scientist. Wilhelm von Humboldt went in for classical studies, for linguistics, came up with a theory of language that Noam Chomsky seems to value very much. Then as a young man, he wrote a book that you can still find in English translation, and it's translated now as The Limits of State Action. And it is, Hayek and Mises both said it's the greatest work of liberalism in the German language. Not a long book, and he talks about the importance of individuality and how individuality has to come from the inside and not be imposed by laws as the old mercantilist and absolutist system would have it, but it has to flourish from the individual outward without unnecessary constraints. The necessary constraints are the ones required for people to be able to live in society together. Basically, the non-aggression principle. Well, you know, he came from a very prominent Prussian family. There was no real Germany in that time. It was divided up into different states. But he came from a very prominent Berlin family, and now. And it was in the diplomatic corps and so on. And now, with the French domination of Germany, he turned 180 degrees and became a fervent German nationalist. And he participated with others in the government in the reform of Prussia. He was in charge of the educational system to elevate, to improve, but also to nationalize and in a way indoctrinate the youth of Germany, or the ones who went to universities, in the ideals of Germanhood. So, and this then cast its shadow all across the 19th century in Germany. Someone like Hegel, for instance, the idea that these ideals of freedom and individualism come from France. There's something alien to Germany. They go against the German character and individualism. The Germans are not naturally individualist. They're more collective people, more organic people than these French and English and so on. So that split between Germany and Western Europe had very bad consequences. There was a German liberalism for a while. Did come mainly from the outside, but it was successful in reshaping Germany and laying the foundations of German prosperity. German prosperity is not based on protectionism the way some people think, and it started long before that through free trade, and also definite property rights established by law, and the opening up of the economy, abolition of guilds, abolition of different mercantilist regulations. In the 60s and 70s, Germany was already on the road to becoming a great economic power. Well, and the liberals had a lot to do with that, but a lot of other things happened. So this was then one of the unfortunate consequences of the Jacobin attempt to spread liberty and democracy through force of arms. And it's a lesson that really is very incumbent on us to learn. Now, a different revolution on the other side of the Atlantic had very different principles, and that was the American Revolution. And I don't know why they bother with the 4th of July anymore. I mean, what the hell do any of these politicians have in common with Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and the others? The founders of the American Republic looked on the great monarchies of Europe as military machines, which is what they were, engaged in constant warfare with each other to build up their empires around the world, meanwhile oppressing their own people and with grinding taxes, ever higher taxes, and in this way financing their imperialist projects. Now, George Washington had something called a farewell address. It's on I don't know if it's on Lou's website, but it's certainly online in a number of different places. And it's worth reading what he actually said in his farewell to the American people. Here's a quote: "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have as little political connection as possible." So you see, he's not an isolationist. Of course, we should trade with the whole world for mutual benefit, but as little political connection as possible. This is the statement that Richard Cobden put on the title page of his first pamphlet in 1836. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I am for free commerce with all nations, political connection with none, and little or no diplomatic establishment." It's in his second inaugural address that he warned against entangling alliances. What was the reason for this? Were they xenophobic? Did they dislike foreigners? No. The answers provided by James Madison, often considered the father of the Constitution, and this is what Madison had to say about war. "Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because war comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From armies proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instrument for bringing the many under the domination of the few." You can go to the Madison building in Washington, across from the Jefferson Library. It's part of the library. It's a law library, and that quote doesn't appear on the walls. Just as you don't have anything of Jefferson's at the Jefferson Memorial to the effect that that government is best which governs least, or were we directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap, we should soon want bread. You know, the sort of things that Jefferson's writings are packed with. Instead, they have some stuff about public education. With Madison, I don't even, well, you know, it just goes through your head, some blah blah thing about democratic or popular government. But nothing like this, huh? In war, too, Madison said, the discretionary power of the executive, the president, is extended. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Another time, Madison wrote, "It may be a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against dangers, real or pretended, from abroad." Now, I say that Madison is well known as the father of the Constitution, And it's no accident that the first article of the Constitution concerns Congress. Congress was supposed to be the basic branch of government. And among the powers granted to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have power to declare war. Okay, the President is commander-in-chief in the sense that once Congress declares war, then the President deploys the armies and the navies. Okay? I wonder how many people, not in the military in America today, I would say probably about at least 10 or 15 million, believe that President Bush is their commander-in-chief. Have you ever come across that? My commander-in-chief, some clerk in a department store or a taxi driver or something. President Bush is my commander-in-chief. Well, no, not really. This principle that Congress shall declare war was so firmly established, so well understood, that even power-hungry presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt did not dare to oppose it and went to Congress to ask for declarations of war in their respective world wars. This was after they had maneuvered America into the position where we were going to have to go to war. But I can't go into that. I'm older than Lou by, I don't know, a few weeks or something, months. And but I think on that basis, I am the last of the Roosevelt haters. It was a great tradition that lasted a long time, and I hope that there'll be some people in the audience here who take it up and carry on the torch. But now we have conservatives today, but conservatives, by the way, who follow the foreign policy of the French Jacobins, of spreading democracy and liberty as they understand it through force of arms. And we have conservatives, so-called, who say that the president has unlimited discretion to wage war, that Congress has nothing to do with it. These are really some conservatives. I don't even know why they use the term conservative. They really believe in the strict construction of the Constitution, as they pride themselves on. The policy of neutrality and non-intervention was the golden rule of American foreign policy until the close of the 19th century. This America, America didn't start in 1933. This America became the economic powerhouse of the world. Stupor mundi was a term that was used sometimes. The wonder of the world, stupor mundi. We didn't send armies or bombers or foreign aid, for that matter, to other countries. Rather, the American attitude was that the United States should set an example and be a beacon to the world, showing what a free people could achieve. This was the meaning and point of the Statue of Liberty, by the way, which the French sent us as a birthday present 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. The statue had nothing to do with immigration. That was a poem added afterwards. The name of the statue was Liberty Enlightening the World. That's why she's carrying a torch. So America was to be the great example. There were, of course, wars in the 19th century, the War of 1812, the war against Mexico, and then the terrible ordeal of the 1860s. As far as the Mexican War goes, Abraham Lincoln, who was then a congressman from Illinois, denounced President Polk and his war in very strident terms. A few years later, the same Abraham Lincoln was responsible for by far the greatest bloodletting in American history. 620,000 deaths, north and south. It's a little less than all of our other wars put together. One of our instructors here, Tom DeLorenzo, has made a study of the career of Abraham Lincoln and produced some, I would say, very judicious and even-handed books on the subject. which you can look at in the bookstore here, and points out that Lincoln was, for instance, a racist. To the end of his days, he hoped that all the blacks in America would be sent somewhere else, maybe to Liberia or Central America or something. He was against the extension of slavery because the slaves would compete with free labor in the plain states and the new states in the West and so on. And Lincoln could not have made it clearer. The reason he attacked the South was not because of slavery. It was because of the Union, for the sake of the Union. He said that explicitly in a letter to Horace Greeley. He said, if I could have preserved the Union and abolished slavery, I would have done that. If I could have preserved the Union by keeping slavery, I would have done that. There had been a proposed 13th Amendment. You know, finally the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. But there had been a proposed 13th Amendment which guaranteed the rights of slave owners in the present territory for the end of time. And Lincoln supported that. It didn't pass as an amendment to the Constitution because it was overcome by events. But, well, you know, originally it was just the 7 Gulf states, well, more than South Carolina and Georgia elsewhere, but basically around the Gulf, that seceded. Okay? It was only after Lincoln maneuvered the South into firing on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, you know, was a fort guarding a customs house. Lincoln insisted that they continue in the middle of the biggest port in the South to collect the Republican protective tariff. Okay, and the Southerners didn't think that was such a great idea. They made the tactical mistake of being the first ones to fire on Fort Sumter, and then Lincoln ordered the invasion of the South. It was then that the border states, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and above all Virginia, decided to join the secession. Without that, especially without Virginia, it's hard to see how long the Gulf states could have held out. But as Jeff Hummel argues, it doesn't matter. Supposing that the original secessionist states had held out, well, the Union, now in the hands of Republicans and many abolitionists among them, would have repealed the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act had obliged Northern authorities to look out for fugitive slaves coming from the South and arrange to have them returned to their masters. But now that as soon as you got, let's say, to the Ohio border or maybe even the Virginia border, you were free, there'd be a steady stream of fugitive slaves. And Jeff Hummel, who knows a lot about the Civil War, has a book, I don't know if it's available here, but easily found, called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men. Jeff is really basically an economist, an economic historian, but also a historian, and it's an excellent book with a tremendous bibliography. It's worth reading about the Civil War. Again, he's in no way a defender of slavery, but talking about the consequences then of the Civil War. Okay, so this is what was going on in America for a while. Meanwhile, the liberal movements were spreading in Europe, and the great liberals in Europe, the most consistent liberals, the most doctrinaire and dogmatic liberals as they were called, were adamant opponents of war, fervent supporters of peace. Cobden was one of the most famous, with his friend John Bright, and they formed what was called the Manchester School. Manchester because that was the basis of their political support in the textile industry and among the textile manufacturers of the northern city of Manchester. There's a two-volume set of the works of political writings of Richard Cobden. Our friend David Hart at the Liberty Fund is in charge of their web pages, I think. And if you look up Liberty Fund, and then there's a section on economic classics or something of that kind, David has put a tremendous amount of stuff on the net, including the two whole big volumes of political writings of Richard Cobden. And you can look up what he has to say. He was an opponent of war and imperialism from the beginning. I have some great quotes from him. Oh yeah, sometimes historians talk about something called free trade imperialism, meaning imperialism, the aim of which is to spread free trade. And Cobden didn't even consider that any part of free trade. He said in 1850, "Away with all attempts to coerce any nation, whether civilized or barbarous, by ships of war, into the adoption of those principles of free trade, which we ourselves only adopted when we became convinced by the process of reason and argument that they were for our own interest." He said, "Affairs of trade, like matters of conscience, change their very nature if touched by the hand of violence. For as faith, if forced, is no longer religion, but hypocrisy, so commerce becomes robbery if coerced by warlike armaments." He had tremendous insights that are continually relevant. For instance, not only the British public, but the members of Parliament had no idea what was going on in the world. They took their cue from the foreign ministers, for instance, Palmerston, who was always in favor of war, and slogans and so on, and stereotypes, thinking that Tsarist Russia was a tremendous threat to Britain, and therefore going to war on behalf of Turkey in a number of times in the 19th century. So that was another reason to avoid foreign adventures, because people just didn't know anything about it. Now, you might think that Richard Cobden was some kind of mealy-mouthed, wimpy, self-hating Englishman. He was, one reason, a personal hero of mine, a robust Englishman, a lover of England, a little Englander, it's true, that is, of England itself and not of this worldwide empire, but he admired England, British culture, institutions, tremendously. On the other hand, he attacked the position of the government. "In the insolence of our might, and without waiting for the assaults of envious enemies, we have sallied forth in search of conquest and rapine, and carried bloodshed into every quarter of the globe," was his judgment on English foreign policy, on British foreign policy. And much more could be said along those lines. This tradition continued in England, and as I say, in Europe as a whole, the most consistent, doctrinaire, dogmatic, whatever you want to call them, classical liberals were adamant in opposing war. Frederick Bastiat is certainly a name you should know. You could be the first one at your school to have a Frederick Bastiat T-shirt, because they're on sale right over here. Well, just think of that. In fact, probably the only one in your city or state. And Bastiat was so much against war that he was in favor of France unilaterally disarming in Europe in 1850. He says, who's going to attack us? Who's going to try to conquer France? The Russians are going to come over here. The Russians are only good when they're repelling attacks on their own country. Afghanistan, for instance, showed that. Sure, they'll fight to the death in defense of their own country. Prussia's going to attack us. Who's going to attack France? So why do we have a military budget at all? Now, Herbert Spencer, whom you probably have heard of, He was once very highly admired as a philosopher and a scientist in England. Spencer died around 1905, same time the other great liberals were dying off. But he was still around in time to condemn the Boer War. Now, the Boer War was a war that England fought against the Dutch settlers. They weren't a colony of Holland anymore, but Dutch settlers in South Africa. In Transvaal, in the Orange Free State, especially in Transvaal, they had discovered, enormous amounts of gold and all the diamonds in the world. And England thought the time had come to bring Christianity to these Dutch settlers. And for no good reason, they declared war and invaded the Dutch republics. Didn't go very well for England. They had to resort to introducing concentration camps. Concentration camps, literally concentrating the population. And with the hygienic conditions of the time, great amounts of deaths among the civilians. And Spencer wrote an essay about that, about the war. He said, I was an English patriot. We had Magna Carta. We had the rule of Parliament over the king. We had our Bill of Rights. But my English patriotism could not survive the Boer War. And he said, if any English soldier goes and fights in a war simply on command of his officers, without knowing what the causes of the war are, without knowing really where the justice lies, I don't care if he lives or dies. This business about support our troops, our troops, our troops. Spencer's view was the soldier is inflicting pain and death on foreigners. He doesn't even know why. Just listens to the propaganda of his superiors. But and other classical liberals could be mentioned. Now, I mentioned Benjamin Constant last time, earlier part of the century, and I want to mention him again in connection with this. Constant developed a theory that Spencer also propounded, that war was dying out. War was relevant and sometimes maybe even required at an earlier stage in history. Well, for one thing, when wars could actually pay, when you could get enough plunder from the enemy to make war profitable. But now we live in an age of commerce and industry, and that's what is going to prevail, not the military spirit, but the industrial spirit. And Spencer, as a sociologist, carried that on. So this was a kind of optimistic theory about the eventual disappearance of war. Well, it turned out otherwise. Incidentally, there was a war in the middle of the century, 1854 to 1856, called the Crimean War, between France and England and Turkey on one side, and Russia on the other. To this day, historians don't know why the war broke out. Cobden and Bright opposed the war. Well, they found out who was in favor of the war when the next election came, and they were defeated by their own middle-class voters. The people who had lionized them, made them into heroes, now turned against them because of their jingoism, their war hysteria. And now liberals were coming to the idea, well, war is not just caused by kings and aristocrats. There are certain business interests also that are involved in war. The classic anti-war position by an American is something which is certainly online. You just look it up. This is by a man named William Graham Sumner. William Graham Sumner. Sumner was the first professor of sociology in the U.S. at Yale. He was a hardcore free market man, gold standard, free trade. In fact, the Republican trustees at Yale tried to get him fired because he was such a free trade advocate. Is against coercive unionism and against imperialism. Now, I don't know about your towns. Maybe you come from places that don't go back that far. But in northeastern cities, there's usually a statue to some veteran of the Spanish-American War, as there is, for instance, in Buffalo. I lay a wreath at that statue every once a year. It's very touching. The Spanish-American War came about because a certain cabal had gotten control of American foreign policy. They included Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, an influential senator from Massachusetts, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an admiral at the Navy Department, and they influenced President McKinley. They hyped up a war fever against Spain. The American battleship Maine had been blown up in Havana Harbor. Nobody asked, why was it in Havana Harbor to begin with? On a goodwill tour. And the Spaniards were blamed for it, which is ridiculous, since they're the last people who had any reason to blow it up. Probably the Cuban insurgents had more reason to get America into the war on their side. In any case, a few months afterwards, America went to war with Spain. And now, the people who were in control of American foreign policy were going to take advantage. It wasn't much of a war, by the way. The Spanish wooden fleet, mainly wooden fleet, set out from Spain, and they were sure that they were going to conquer because they were placed under the protection of the Virgin Mary. Meanwhile, the Americans had built up this ocean-going navy, and so the Spaniards were blown out of the water. And in return, they took advantage of the occasion to annex Hawaii, not a Spanish colony, but there'd been the controversy over Hawaii, and now, well, everybody was in favor of America expanding. Puerto Rico, okay, Cuba was a protectorate virtually, and then also the Philippines. In one swoop, we were an Asian power. Okay, 7,000 miles away from the American coast. And you could already see on a collision course with Japan, because we were right in the middle of all of this turbulent foreign policy. Well, Americans were very proud of this. It was the first war we'd fought North and South together. The Yankees, that is the Northerners, took on the Southern way of referring to the Filipinos as niggers. Okay? And the course of putting down the Philippines, because the Filipinos thought that they were going to be, that they cast off Spanish control and now they were going to be independent. No way. And in the course of putting down the Philippine insurrection, probably around 200,000 of them were killed in our first war in Asia. Well, Sumner was an old man by now. He was the grand old man of American social science. He got up at the Reform Club in New Haven and gave a speech called The Conquest of the United States by Spain. Caught people's attention. What did he mean by that? He said, well, in this little war, we have won militarily. There was never any question of that. But we have fought the Spaniards on the field of ideas, and that we have lost, because we've been taken over by the Spanish idea of empire. The Spanish idea which has brought Spain to where it is today. Spain was the first great European empire. Okay? It was of Spain that it was first said, this is an empire on which the sun never sets. And well, you know, not only the Philippines on the other side of the world, but most of the West, what is now the Western United States, Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, many islands and posts on the coast of Africa as well. And this was the great Spanish Empire, and also in Europe, Naples, Milan, the Low Countries. Talked last time about the revolt of the Low Countries. This was the great Spanish Empire. Okay? It was another attempt to impose hegemony on Europe, which failed. And money, gold and silver kept flowing in from the New World, for instance. They lost the taxes of the Netherlands, but still, money kept coming in. But taxes and debts increased more than the income of the government. Spain, the Spanish government eventually had to declare bankruptcy a few times. And Sumner says, this is the story of empire. This is the story of empire. Endless wars, perpetual war to preserve or expand or prevent from diminishing the imperial territories. Taxes, public debt, the efforts of society directed into the military rather than the industrial sector, or in manning the positions of empire, which is what happened in Spain. Nobody wanted to work, especially after the Jews and then the Moors were thrown out. Nobody wanted to work anymore. And the aristocrats went to the New World to be commissioners and mayors and so on. And so Spain went gradually downhill. At one time it was one of the great centers of European culture. And then, by the 18th century, people who went to Spain said, what is this? Is this Turkey? Is this the Balkans? Desolated villages, abandoned farms. There was no business to speak of. Well, this didn't happen because of a natural catastrophe. It happened because of government. And Sumner said, well, that was the Spanish way. The Spaniards chose the path of empire and glory. The Spanish phrase or proverb, evidently, may God deny you peace but give you glory. Okay? It's a proud kind of way of life. But Sumner says it wasn't the American way of life. The American way of life was much more commonsensical, on a smaller scale. It was much more bourgeois rather than and middle class rather than aristocratic. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of individual happiness. The American ideal was not to find glory on battlefields or raising flags on Mount Suribachi. It was to find happiness in your family, in your work, in your business, in your community, in your church. As Jefferson said many times, by following your own studies, if you have that kind of penchant. And now, Sumner says, now we're going on the Spanish road, and we're leaving the American road. And, well, Sumner says, he was a relativist, by the way. He said, you know, I'm just a value-free social scientist. I don't say it's good or bad. I just outline probable causes and effects. And America will probably continue on this road to empire and glory and final decline. So he says, why am I talking about it now, since I think that's what's in the cards? He says, well, this dream that the founders had, that we followed for a long time, it was really of such a nature that it shouldn't be allowed to die without some kind of tribute to it. It was a signature. For a long while, it was a signature of the American people. The small policy, not what Theodore Roosevelt called the large policy. Minding our own business, being a beacon of freedom to the world, and now it's gone. Well, I like to mention Sumner in these talks to leave you with the sense of optimism that permeated his work and that permeates my own view. How there's no way things are going to get better, but on the other hand, it's worth the effort to fight for what was a great and noble ideal. A lot more could be said about the classical liberalism and War and Peace, but now we do have a few minutes for comments on your part and for questions if you have any. Thank you. Yes.
What would you say to those that say in the age of nuclear weapons there's a difference between now and then? What would the reaction be?
Well, sure, nuclear weapons are much more devastating, obviously. Of course, that's much more of a reason to stay out of war and to avoid potential war through diplomacy or deterrence. That's what the U.S. did for 50 years against the Soviet Union. It was based on a policy of deterrence, but I don't see that that makes for any reason for invading countries or going against the basic principles of the founding fathers of not involving ourselves in potential problems around the world that are none of our business. Yes.
Statue of Liberty celebrating our first century of freedom,
Yeah.
1876. It's also the date of Custer's last scene.
Oh.
How would Spencer interpret
What
war?
was the date? July 4th, 1876?
No, it was that same. It was about a week before.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yes.
okay.
So how would Spencer reinterpret the American Indian?
No, I mean Sumner?
Sumner, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Reinterpret.
The American Indian.
He didn't have too much to say about that. He has a biography of Andrew Jackson, and the section on the Indian removal of the 5 civilized tribes that occurred under Jackson and was endorsed by Jackson, the Cherokees, Choctaws, and the others, he deprecates it, but does not attack it, I think, in the way it should have been attacked.
We expect the Midwest to be a very good buffalo pasture, no St. Louis, no
Well, yeah, but by Sumner's time, that was not a question anymore. What had happened was that a modern industrial society encountered basically a Stone Age society, and the result was pretty inevitable. Very deplorable. There's no reason why they had to treat people like that. There's no reason why they had to break their own treaties with the Indians, the treaties that they had set up with the Indians, giving them reserved areas, broken by the U.S. government, broken by Lincoln's administration, by the way, in regard to Indian tribes in Minnesota. So it could have been done in a much more humane and civilized way. Didn't have to include these massacres and so on. But when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1831 and went down the Mississippi, one of the things he saw was I think it was the Choctaws being transported to the other side of the Mississippi on the Trail of Tears. And Tocqueville said, well, what I saw in their sad faces was the inevitable end of a people. Now, thankfully, it didn't happen altogether. I mean, to 100%, but it happened to a great extent, and I think that the politicians, but supported also by the government, were culpable. Now, in the case of the Plains Indians in North Dakota and so on, an interesting fact, there was an article in some libertarian journal, JLS maybe, about that. It happened that the farmers who had settled there had entered into a modus vivendi with the Indian tribes. And although there was some friction, there was no question of attempted extermination until the Union Army came in after the Civil War. And now the cost of getting rid of the Indians was socialized. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, the farmers themselves didn't have to pay for it anymore. The American taxpayer could pay for it. And the American taxpayer did, to the benefit of the transcontinental railroads and other interests. So there you have an example where, under the worst circumstances, for instance, in Palestine, let's say in centuries before the British got involved, Jews and Arabs lived together, and there were problems, but there were no insurrections or riots or the kind of terrible problems that have occurred since. Yes?
Could we say that the ideals of our founding fathers had within them sort of the seeds for the destruction of the ideal? In other words, was the experiment of limited government and democracy or framed democracy not work? Because in my limited opinion, basically, they tried to set up a republic that would be protecting liberty from democracy, and that sort of didn't happen.
I see what you're saying, and there's a man running for president that interests me. I don't know if you've heard of him, Ron Paul, and he calls himself a constitutionalist. Well, my feeling is this is what the Constitution has become, or the Constitution was tried, and it eroded over time, and maybe the time has come to look in another direction, that is of total decentralization, of breaking down of central powers and so on. So I think you have a point there. Just something just occurred to me. There's the great, in the Declaration, is a great statement of universal principles, etc. But then when it comes to the grievances they have against King George, one is that he has encouraged the merciless Indian savage, whose one known rule of warfare is the indiscriminate massacre of men, women, and children. So here's the great liberal Jefferson categorizing. And when in other places, Jefferson spoke about the Indian system of government as approaching the absence of government. But here, maybe it was to appeal to the frontier population, talking in these terms about Indians. Somebody, yes?
Rob, just a very minor point. When Jimmy Carter first became president, his old mentor, Admiral Hyman Rickover, had for years wanted to investigate the sinking of the Maine.
Uh-huh.
So Carter paid for taxpayers paid for an expedition. They sent miniature subs down and investigated the whole thing, and the explosion came from inside the Maine.
Yeah.
So they came to the conclusion it was a boiler blow.
Yeah, that's or that coal dust had somehow combusted spontaneously. I think that's the. What I was saying was that as far as motivation goes, if anybody was motivated to blow it up, it would have been the Cuban rebels rather than the Spaniards. This is like the Grim Reaper here. Thank you.